wind howled through the narrow streets of the small town, rattling the windows of the inn where Thomas Harper sat alone nursing a drink. He had been hearing rumors, stories whispered in the dim glow of lanterns, tales of strange occurrences. People spoke of doors locking themselves, objects moving without explanation, and heavy footsteps in empty hallways. But Thomas, a man of logic, dismissed them as paranoia, yet something gnawed at the back of his mind. He had seen the reports, a scientist gone mad, a man who had supposedly vanished into thin air. The London papers called him a genius turned monster, an experiment gone horribly wrong. The thought made Thomas uneasy, but he brushed it aside, focusing instead on the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Then, a sound, a faint shuffle against the wooden floorboards behind him. He turned quickly, expecting to see someone. No one, just the empty room, dimly lit by candlelight. His heart skipped a beat. Had it been the wind, a trick of his imagination? He shook his head and took another sip, ignoring the creeping dread curling in his stomach. A chair across the room scraped against the floor. This time it was unmistakable. He froze, his fingers tightening around the mug. The firelight flickered. "Who's there?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. Silence. Then a whisper, so close to his ear that he felt the warmth of breath, though there was no one to be seen. "You can't see me, but I can see you." Thomas's blood ran cold. Thomas lurched forward, nearly knocking over his drink. His eyes darted around the empty tavern, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. He had felt it, warmth against his skin, the unmistakable sensation of someone close enough to whisper in his ear. He shot to his feet, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. The innkeeper, polishing a glass behind the counter, looked up with a start. "You all right, Harper?" the old man asked, raising a bushy eyebrow. Thomas swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod. "Thought I heard something," he muttered, his voice tight. He turned slowly, scanning the room. Nothing moved. The fire still crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows along the walls. The doors and windows were shut. There was no way anyone could have entered without him noticing. Yet the presence lingered. It pressed against him like an unseen weight, making the hairs on his neck stand on end. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, but his pride kept him rooted to the spot. He exhaled sharply. "If this is some sort of joke, it isn't funny," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Silence. Then the glass in his hand was knocked from his grip. It shattered against the wooden floor, the sound sharp and violent. He staggered back, eyes widening in horror. The innkeeper frowned. "Harper, what the hell are you?" The words died in his throat as something unseen brushed past him, knocking over a stool on its way to the door. The old man paled. "Dear God," he whispered. Thomas didn't wait to hear more. He turned and bolted, his pulse pounding in his ears. Behind him, the tavern door creaked open by itself, then slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Thomas stumbled into the empty street, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The night air was sharp and cold, but it did nothing to quell the burning panic in his chest. He spun around, searching for any sign of movement. The town lay silent, the houses dark, their windows like empty eyes staring back at him. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. He took a step back. The cobblestone beneath his boots, uneven. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, a soft chuckle just to his left. A whisper of breath, though no one was there. "You can run, but you can't hide." Thomas whirled around, fists clenched, his mind racing for logic, for reason. There had to be an explanation. Had to be. A prank? A trick of the wind? But deep down, he knew better. He had read about the scientist, Griffin, a man who had vanished into nothing. A man who had tampered with the natural order and paid the price. Thomas took another step back. A hand, ice cold and unseen, gripped his wrist. He let out a strangled cry and yanked free, stumbling backward. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then, out of nowhere, an invisible force shoved him, sending him sprawling onto the cobblestones. He barely had time to register the pain before something grabbed him by the collar and yanked him up. The voice returned, no longer amused, low, seething, right in his ear. "You think you're afraid now?" A pause. "Wait until I decide to show you what real fear is." Then, just as quickly as it came, the presence was gone. Thomas lay there, gasping, his body trembling. But he knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Thomas staggered to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. He wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand, his breath still uneven. The town remained deathly silent, as if the world itself held its breath. But he knew better. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching him. He turned in frantic circles, his eyes scanning the darkness. He couldn't see him, couldn't see it, but he knew it was there. Hiding. Waiting. This was no ordinary nightmare. This was something worse. He forced himself to move, his boots scraping against the uneven stones as he half ran, half stumbled through the empty streets. His mind raced. He needed to get away, to find shelter, to... A hand wrapped around his ankle. Thomas barely had time to scream before he was yanked off his feet. He hit the ground hard, his head slamming against the stones. Stars exploded behind his eyes. Pain roared through his skull. Before he could regain his senses, he was being dragged, pulled backward by something he couldn't see. "No, no. Let me go," he shouted, clawing at the ground. His nails scraped against the rough stone, but it was useless. The grip was inhumanly strong, unrelenting. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Thomas gasped for breath, rolling onto his side. His heart hammered so violently that he thought it might burst. He scrambled to his feet, swaying unsteadily. He expected another attack, another unseen hand to grab him. But nothing came. Instead, a voice whispered from the shadows, so close it felt like it was inside his head. "Run!" Thomas didn't hesitate. He turned and bolted, his terror-fueled legs carrying him through the twisting streets. But no matter how fast he ran, no matter how far he went, he knew the invisible man was right behind him. Thomas sprinted through the empty streets, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. The town was a maze of twisting alleys and silent houses, but he didn't stop to think. He couldn't. Every instinct in his body told him one thing: run. But no matter how fast he moved, he could feel it. The presence, the weight of unseen eyes locked onto him. A cruel, taunting laugh echoed through the night. Close. Too close. He rounded a corner, nearly losing his footing on the damp cobblestones. His mind raced. He needed to get indoors, needed to find shelter, a door with a lock, walls between him and it. The old church. It wasn't far. Thomas forced his legs to move faster, ignoring the stitch in his side. He reached the small chapel, its wooden doors looming before him. He lunged forward, gripping the handle with shaking hands. Locked. Locked. "No," he gasped. He rattled the door, his panic rising. Come on, come on." Something cold brushed against the back of his neck. Thomas went rigid. The breath left his body in a shuddering gasp. Then, fingers. Invisible fingers curled gently around his throat. Not squeezing. Not yet. Just there. A silent reminder. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. He didn't dare move. A whisper, soft as death itself, caressed his ear. "Do you know what it feels like?" Thomas swallowed hard, his pulse hammering beneath the invisible grip. The voice continued, slow and venomous. "To have your body fade away, to be nothing but a ghost in your own skin?" A pause, a sharp, humorless chuckle. "No, but you will." And then, pressure. Thomas choked as the unseen hands tightened, cutting off his air. He clawed at his neck, but his fingers grasped at nothing. His vision blurred, dark spots creeping at the edges. His knees buckled. Just as the darkness threatened to take him, the grip loosened. Thomas crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath and sucking in air like a drowning man. Above him, the air shifted, as if he was leaning down. This is just the beginning. And then footsteps, soft, slow, moving away. But Thomas knew the truth. The invisible man wasn't leaving. He was waiting. Thomas lay on the cold ground, his breath ragged, his throat burning from the unseen hands that had nearly crushed the life out of him. He coughed violently, his entire body trembling. He had never felt terror like this, primal, consuming. His fingers clawed at the damp cobblestones as he forced himself onto his hands and knees. He needed to move. He needed to think. The invisible man wasn't just toying with him. He was hunting him. And Thomas had nowhere to hide. The wind howled through the empty streets, whipping around him like a ghost's whisper. He strained his ears, listening, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps. But there was nothing. No movement. No breath. Just silence. Which meant he was still there. Watching. Waiting. Thomas knew he had two choices. Stay here and wait for another attack, or move. His entire body screamed at him to run. But logic, if logic even mattered anymore, told him he couldn't outrun something he couldn't see. His mind spun, trying to grasp at anything that could help him. There had to be some way to detect him, some way to fight back. Then a memory surfaced, something from the stories, from the reports. The Wasn't truly a ghost. He wasn't supernatural. He was real. A man, flesh and blood, which meant he left traces. The idea gave Thomas a sliver of hope. He reached out blindly, fumbling at the ground, scooping up a handful of dirt and debris. His fingers clenched around it as he slowly got to his feet. He took a deep breath, then, without warning, hurled the dirt into the air around him. For a split second, the dust swirled in the wind, catching nothing. Then, it landed, and there he was, a faint outline, a man-shaped void where the dust should have fallen naturally. It lasted only a second before the wind scattered it away, but Thomas saw enough. He wasn't alone, and worse, the invisible man was standing inches away from him. Thomas barely had time to react before something struck him hard in the ribs, sending him sprawling once again. He hit the ground with a grunt, pain flaring through his side. A cruel, satisfied chuckle echoed in the empty street. "Clever," the voice said, "but not clever enough." Thomas tried to scramble backward, but an unseen force gripped his arm, twisting it painfully behind his back. He cried out, struggling uselessly. The invisible man leaned in close, his breath hot against Thomas's ear. "I was going to let this last a little longer," he murmured. "But now you've made things interesting." Thomas barely had time to scream before he was yanked into the darkness. Thomas thrashed wildly as he was dragged into the darkness, his boots scraping against the cobblestones, his fingers clawing at the ground. But it was useless. The grip on his arm was unbreakable, cold, inhumanly strong. He couldn't see his attacker, couldn't fight back, couldn't even predict where the next strike would come from. The street blurred past him as he was hauled backward, deeper into the twisting alleys of the town. The few oil lamps flickering in the distance grew fainter and fainter until there was only blackness. Then he stopped. The grip vanished. Thomas gasped for breath, scrambling to his feet, his back pressed against the damp brick wall of a narrow alleyway. He could hear his own heartbeat, hammering like a drum in his chest. His breath came in ragged gulps, misting in the cold night air. Silence. He wasn't alone. He knew he wasn't alone. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign, any clue. But there was nothing, just the empty alley stretching out before him. Then, a whisper from the darkness. "Tell me, Thomas, what does it feel like?" He stiffened. His name. It knew his name. The voice was soft, almost amused. "What does it feel like to be completely powerless, to have no control over what happens next?" A pause. "To know that no one will ever believe what happened to you?" Thomas's breath hitched. Another sound. Footsteps. Right next to him. He swung wildly, his fist cutting through empty air. Nothing. A chuckle. "You can't fight what you can't see." Thomas pressed himself harder against the wall, his mind screaming for a way out, a weapon, a plan, anything. Then something brushed against his face. A finger, slowly tracing along his cheek. Thomas flinched, slapping at the air, but there was nothing to hit. "You feel that, don't you?" the invisible man whispered. That helplessness, that fear. The touch disappeared, only for an unseen hand to grip his throat again. Thomas choked, his hands flying up to grasp at nothing. The pressure increased, cutting off his air, his vision darkening at the edges. His knees buckled as his body screamed for oxygen. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. He collapsed to the ground, coughing violently, clutching at his bruised throat. Above him, the voice was closer than ever. "I could have ended this already," the invisible man murmured. "But where's the fun in that?" Thomas trembled, barely able to lift his head. A final whisper, dripping with malice. "See you soon." Then, nothing. The air was still. The presence was gone. But Thomas knew the game had only just begun. Thomas lay on the cold ground, gasping for air, his entire body trembling. His throat throbbed where the invisible man's unseen fingers had gripped him. The ache a cruel reminder that he had been utterly at his mercy. He forced himself up on shaking arms, his breath uneven, his mind raced. What did he want? Why him? He had heard the stories. The mad scientist, the dangerous recluse, the man who had vanished into nothing. But those were just tales, warnings passed around in hushed voices. Now, Thomas knew the truth. The invisible man was real, and worse, he was toying with him. Thomas forced himself onto his feet, swaying unsteadily. His heart still pounded in his chest, a frantic rhythm of terror. He had to think, had to do something before the next attack. The bastard was enjoying this, stalking him, breaking him down piece by piece. He staggered out of the alley, the town eerily quiet around him. The lamps lining the streets flickered weakly, casting long shadows that twisted in the wind. He needed to get inside, somewhere safe, somewhere he could think. The inn. Thomas swallowed hard and forced himself forward, every step feeling like he was being watched, because he was. He knew the invisible man wasn't gone, just waiting. The inn came into view, its warm glow spilling onto the empty street. He stumbled toward it, his hands shaking as he reached for the door handle. It turned, unlocked. He slipped inside, slamming the door behind him and bolting it shut. His chest heaved. The tavern was empty now. The innkeeper must have retired for the night. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting weak, flickering light. Thomas didn't care. He was inside. Safe, or so he thought. Then, a sound, a soft creak from the far end of the room. His blood turned to ice. The air in the room suddenly felt wrong, thick, suffocating. He wasn't alone. Thomas turned, his hands clenched into fists, his breath uneven. "Show yourself," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. Then a chair, sitting innocently in the corner, slowly slid across the wooden floor. Thomas took a step back, his body trembling. A quiet chuckle drifted through the room, surrounding him, filling the empty space like a creeping fog. "You locked the door," the invisible man murmured. "How adorable." Something brushed against Thomas's shoulder. He screamed. Thomas lurched away from the unseen touch, his scream strangled in his throat. His back hit the wall, his breath coming in frantic gasps. His eyes darted wildly across the room, searching, desperate for any sign of movement, for anything that would tell him where it was. But there was nothing. Just the dying fire, the flickering shadows, and that voice. His voice. Low, mocking, everywhere and nowhere at once. "You're trembling, Thomas," a chuckle. "Good. You should be." The room felt like it was closing in, the very air pressing against his skin. Thomas swallowed hard, his mind screaming for a plan, anything that could help him. His eyes fell on the fireplace. Embers still smoldered in the hearth, casting faint orange light. Heat. Ash. He had seen the dust reveal him before. Maybe this could work, too. Moving quickly, he lunged forward, grabbing the iron poker resting beside the hearth. He thrust it into the embers, stirring up a small cloud of glowing ash. Without hesitating, he spun and threw it into the room. For a split second, the ash swirled through the air, empty, weightless. Then, some of it clung, and there he was. A faint, nightmarish outline of a man, just feet away. Thomas barely had time to register it before an invisible force slammed into him. He was hurled backward, crashing into a table, sending plates and bottles shattering to the floor. Pain exploded through his ribs. The outline disappeared as the ash scattered, but Thomas knew he was still there. The voice now sharp, seething. "You're getting irritating!" Thomas groaned, clutching his side, forcing himself to stand. "Good," he spat, his voice hoarse. "That means I'm doing something right." A pause. Then a slow, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Moving toward him. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Then a chair lifted itself into the air and hurtled toward him. He barely dodged in time. The chair smashed into the wall behind him, splintering into pieces. Thomas stumbled forward, grabbing blindly at the fireplace tools. He found the poker again, gripping it tight. "If I can't see you," he panted, steadying himself, "then I'll just have to hit everything until I do." A chuckle. But this time it was angry. "Oh, Thomas," the invisible man murmured. "You really shouldn't have said that." Then the attack came. Fast. Brutal. Unseen fists crashing into him from every direction. Thomas barely had time to scream before the world went black.